let's look now at utilitarianism more specifically, and a distinction between the classical form of utilitarianism and another form that's been developed in the last century in particular. So, as I said, utilitarianism is a well-known historical theory, usually attributed to Jeremy Bentham, the English reformer, philosopher, general writer. Bentham was something of a polymath, wrote a great deal about ethics, about law reform, and was, as I say, the founder of the school of English utilitarians in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And for him, the good, remember what we're talking about with consequentialism, is to produce the best consequences. So the best consequences for Bentham meant the consequences that will produce the greatest possible surplus of pleasure over pain. So it's quite a simple, down-to-earth sort of view. We all know what pleasure is. We all know what pain is. So that's what we ought to maximize. That if you think of it as an action producing some pleasure and some pain, well, you subtract the pain from the pleasure and you see what is going to have produced the most pleasure, or perhaps if all of your choices are going to produce more pain than pleasure, then the amount that produces the least pain. And Bentham was really quite straightforward about this, and was prepared to be what some people might say reasonably crude about it. So people said, well, this is a philosophy suitable for pigs, not for humans. Yes, they can get lots of pleasure wallowing in the mud or whatever, but we humans have higher things. What about the great achievements of our great cultural achievements? What about poetry? Are you saying that poetry is only of value because it produces more pleasure? Surely, some person may actually get more pleasure from playing some very simple game. There was a pub game played in England at the time called pushpin. Don't ask me how you play it, I don't really know. But it's famous because Bentham responded to this objection by saying, if quantities of pleasure are equal, pushpin is as good as poetry, which many people thought shows just how crude utilitarianism is and that we should not accept it. Of course, he does say if quantities of pleasure are equal. And when he talks about quantities of pleasure, he doesn't just mean the quantities you get in the moment, right? So maybe you play pushpin for half an hour, you read poetry for half an hour, you get more pleasure from that in that half hour from pushpin than you did from reading poetry. But that's not the end of the story. It might be that the poetry comes back to you over the following days and months and enriches your experiences in a whole range of ways, increasing your pleasure. Or it may be that you can go back to reading great poetry again and again and it continues to give you pleasure. Whereas pushpin, it's a simple game. Once you've played it a few times, you know how it works, you get bored with it. It doesn't give you pleasure anymore. So Bentham is not actually saying simply pushpin is as good as poetry. He's saying it would be if the quantities of pleasure were equal. And at least in that famous quotation, he doesn't discuss further whether the quantities of pleasure are equal, but he does talk about the importance of duration and a variety of other things about pleasure. The second of the great 19th century utilitarians was John Stuart Mill. And he was troubled by this idea of pushpin and poetry being equally good. And he tried to introduce a distinction in quality of pleasures. So he said that, maybe the fool thinks that he can get as much pleasure from these simple games as Socrates gets from discussing philosophy. But only Socrates knows both of these experiences. The fool doesn't understand the pleasures of discussing philosophy. And what Socrates realizes is that there's a higher quality that you get from the pleasure of discussing philosophy than you get from the simple pleasures that are available to the fool or to a pig. Mill also refers to a pig again. So he tried, in a way, if you like, to deal with this objection by saying that there's a higher quality of pleasure. But a lot of later philosophers have been troubled by this, including, I just mentioned, he's up there, the third of the great 19th century English utilitarians was a man called Henry Sidgwick, the least well known of the three, but I think clearly, and most philosophers would agree today, the best philosopher of the three. The most careful philosopher of the three, the one who examines objections most thoroughly. I'm not going to give you slabs of Sidgwick to read. He wrote a very long book called The Methods of Ethics. But if you do want to follow up utilitarianism, it's, I think, actually a better, more careful exposition of it than, for example, the work that John Stuart Mill wrote called Utilitarianism, which was, is more widely read, is better written. Mill had a better style. Sidgwick was more of a dry academic style. But I think there's a lot of things in Mill's utilitarianism that are somewhat dubious. And one of them, I think, is this distinction in the quality of pleasure. Because Mill is saying that, you know, he's just talking about pleasure. He claims that he's not talking about something distinct from pleasure. But if that's so, what does it mean to say that there is a difference of quality other than, in some sense, you're getting more pleasure from it? It's not easy to understand what Mill means by this distinction. There's possible responses to that, but Sidgwick thought that the distinction doesn't work, and I think that that's probably right. I think if you do want to be a hedonistic utilitarian, that's the term from the Greek word for pleasure, hedonistic. If you do want to be a hedonistic utilitarian, you better accept the idea that if the quantities of pleasure are equal, simple games, whatever they might be, computer games are as good as poetry. But you can challenge whether the quantities of pleasure actually are equal in the ways I've suggested. But I think that is an implication of hedonistic utilitarianism. Another way of avoiding that implication is to say, well, I'm not a hedonistic utilitarian at all. What I think we ought to be maximizing is the satisfaction of people's preferences. Using the term preference here quite broadly to refer to whatever somebody wants or desires. And this is a view that has become reasonably popular in the 20th century, often pushed by work in economics, in what's known as welfare economics, where economists, modern economics actually grew out of ethics, out of 19th century ethics philosophy. And what happened was that around the turn of the century, the turn between the 19th and the 20th century, and in the early 20th century, economists started to try to make their subject more scientific, more of a science. And they were troubled by the idea that the good to be maximized, when they talked about welfare, the good to be maximized seemed to be a mental state. For the hedonists, it's a mental state, pleasure or pain. And you can't see that. You can't observe it. So there seems to be something unscientific about saying, here's an economic distribution that will maximize the good if you can't actually tell whether it is maximizing the good. So instead they talked about people's preferences, and preferences, they said, are something you can observe through people's behavior. Okay? Does a person prefer an apple or an orange? Well, what do they buy? Assume that they're the same price in the store, and they go into the store. Do they buy an apple or an orange for the same price? Well, if they buy the apple, then you can see that they prefer an apple to an orange. And moreover, by manipulating the prices, you can maybe get something a little bit more sophisticated. You can maybe get indications of how much they prefer the apple to the orange, or how many, they'll prefer at certain prices, they'll prefer one apple to two oranges perhaps, or vice versa. So there's something more observable here, and that's one reason why economists started talking about welfare functions in terms of preferences, or in terms of revealed preferences, choices in the marketplace, rather than in terms of pleasure. And philosophers also picked that up, partly because also it seems less paternalistic. There's something paternalistic about telling people that what's good for you is maximizing your pleasure, even though you may say, well, look, I don't really care about pleasure. Okay, I get less pleasure out of reading poetry than out of playing computer games, but never mind. That's what I want to do. I think that's somehow more important or more worthwhile. And the utilitarian will have, or the hedonistic utilitarian will have to say, you're making some kind of mistake there. So that's the basis for supporting preference utilitarianism. And if you've read chapter 1 of Practical Ethics, you'll see that I've argued there towards preference utilitarianism, but if you're reading the third edition anyway, you'll find that I've also got some hesitations about that. So in fact, if you compare it with the first and second editions, I was more committed to a preference utilitarian view when I wrote those earlier versions, and I've since come to have some doubts about it for a variety of reasons. Partly the problem of talking about mistaken preferences, because people obviously can be misinformed about certain things. They can have preferences for things, and then when they get them, it turns out not to be satisfying, not to be what they wanted. So they may want things for reasons that seem to be misinformed. And in fact, you could say that the point of a lot of advertising is to persuade people to want things, which without the advertising they would not have wanted, and they're no happier when they get them. And if that's the case, then is that a problem for preference utilitarianism? Because the preference utilitarian will still say, this is what's good for them, getting what they want, even if it doesn't make them happier in the end. So there are doubts about that as well, and I'm not going to now argue for one or the other of those two views. I think they both have things to be said in defense of them, and they both have objections, and they're things that you need to think about, at least if you're attracted to a consequentialist position of some sort or other, or a utilitarian position.